So this is the third episode of the season, which means that you've already heard me talk about my affection for Fujifilm cameras. That is, unless you're listening out of order, in which case, go back to the first episode. You're gonna want that context, okay? But I really do shoot on Fujifilm gear in real life. This isn't me hyping a sponsor whose products I don't even use. Fujifilm cameras, they're part of my life, and one of the more reliably pleasant parts of my life. My X-T4 and my GFX 50S2, they always get the job done, and they get the job done well. So if you're thinking about investing in a new camera, give them a look, okay? Alright, on with the show. From Cleopatra and Julius Caesar to Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, on through Beyonce and Jay-Z, power couples have always held a certain mystique. You can't help but wonder, what did Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio talk about over dinner? Or which of Percy Shelley's habits infuriated Mary? Did he chew on his fingernails or talk too loudly after he'd had a few glasses of wine? At least in our imaginations, these couples exist in an interesting state of friction, where the transcendent rubs up against the mundane. These are people of immense skill and drive, but they're also people. Real live people in actual human relationships. They're kind to each other on some occasions and cruel on others. I'm sure Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas spent some of their time discussing the nature of truth and beauty, but I bet they also had dumb inside jokes and reminded each other to pick up some toilet paper on the way home. Icons and geniuses, they're just like us, but, more talented. Few couples embody this dichotomy better than Fritz Lang and Thea von Harbou. He was the most acclaimed German director of his era, and with the career he had, a career that spans from the Berlin of the 19-teens all the way to the Hollywood of the 1960s, he needs to be in the conversation when you're talking about the most important directors of all time. She was a celebrated novelist who became her country's preeminent scenarist or screenwriter. And she didn't just write all of Fritz's films from 1920 through the early 1930s, she wrote screenplays for other titans of European cinema, like F.W. Murnau and Carl Theodor Dreyer. Lang and von Harbou's creative partnership helped to establish Berlin as a global hub of filmmaking, the only place with the audacity to challenge Hollywood's dominance. Many of their collaborations are classics. There's Dr. Mabuse the Gambler, which we discussed in the last episode, and its 1933 sequel, The Testament of Dr. Mabuse. There's the Wagnerian epic Die Nibelungen, and M, which introduced the world to Peter Lorre in his legendary performance as a child murderer. And perhaps most famously, there's Metropolis, the pioneering sci-fi film that flopped in its time but is now rightly considered a classic. Their partnership was as creative as the Weimar era itself, and as tumultuous. Appropriately, their story is the stuff that movies are made of. Passion, betrayal, triumph, tragedy, the rise of fascism, the despair of the refugee, and even a highly suspicious death. There is a lot to cover here, so much that I need to break their narrative up into 2 episodes. We'll start the tale of Fritz and Thea today, looking at their emergence as cinematic royalty alongside the emergence of Germany's fascist right. And then, after a 1-episode interlude, we'll wrap things up in 2 weeks. I'm Travis Mushett, and welcome to The Haunted Screen. Now let's check out the man behind the monocle and the woman whose stories made them both famous.
Dr. Mabuse the Gambler, I understand that's a film you made.
Just having a little fun with you. Call me Fritz Lang if you prefer.
We don't know exactly when Friedrich Fritz Lang and Thea von Harbou met, but it was probably sometime in 1919, when they were both working at Decla, the studio that would put out Robert Wiener's Cabinet of Dr. Caligari the following year. He would have been around 29 years old, and a rising star in the Berlin film scene. Even before Lang had picked up a camera, Decla's head of production, Eric Palmer, realized that Fritz was something special. A theater director who knew the two men had set up a professional blind date, and by the end of their first conversation, Palmer was sold on Lang. He wrote that Fritz, quote, sensed that film in the future could no longer content itself with a simple photographic rendition of plots and things, as was customary until then. With the eyes of a painter, Lang saw that the photographic lens, that is the eye of the camera, must serve, by using light and shadow effects, to fuse performance, plot, and background into a unified entity to somehow create a film composition. In other words, before basically anyone else, Lang understood film's potential to become more than just a tool to preserve theatrical performances. It could, in fact it must, grow to become an art form of its own. So Palmer hired him, first as a dramaturg and writer so that he could learn the ropes, and then, once Lang had gotten a grasp of the mechanics of filmmaking, as a director. At around age 31, the screenwriter Thea von Harbou was 2 years older than Lang. By this point, she was already a successful writer. Von Harbou penned her first novel when she was just a teenager, and during World War I, she turned to writing books that celebrated German culture and the soldiers she believed were defending it. Books with names like The Young Watch on the Rhine, War and Women, and Adrian Drost in His Country. She looked the part of a German patriot too. As her biographer Reinhold Kiner put it, she was a handsome Germanic type, with blue eyes and blonde hair. It was a look that paired well with Lang's. While he was Austrian by birth and half Jewish by blood, Lang had done his best to adopt a stereotypically German style. Even as a young man, he wore a monocle, a piece of eyewear associated with the Prussian aristocracy. Lang claimed that he needed the monocle due to an injury sustained during his time fighting on the Eastern Front, but a cousin of his remembers him wearing it prior to the war, which suggests it could be at least as much an affectation as an ocular necessity. By Lang's own admission, even his greatest professional champions suspected this was the case, at least when they first met.
Erich Pommer came to Vienna and I wore a monocle. Always. And he said, I don't want to have anything to do with this haughty son of a bitch.
Whatever the reason, he looked so prototypically German that in 1918, a theater producer approached him at a cafe and offered him a role as a Prussian military officer. Lang and von Harbou quickly realized that they had a lot in common. They both loved horseback riding in the novels of Karl May, a German writer famous for his popular novels set on the American frontier, and both made a strong impression on whoever they met. Lang was intense, intelligent, and arrogant, and he told the best stories, in no small part because, as we'll see, he had no compunction about making them up. Though not as boisterous as Lang, von Harbou was a striking personality herself, so authoritative that people often described her as tall, despite the fact she was just a pedestrian 5'6". After all, her brilliance had been obvious since she was a child. By age 11, von Harbou could recite long passages from Goethe's Faust, and she published a volume of poetry on her 13th birthday. It wasn't long before the pair fell for each other, but there was a bit of a problem. Two problems, really. Both of them were married to other people. Thea von Harbou's husband was the renowned actor Rudolf Klein-Rogge. Lang's wife was a mysterious woman named Lisa Rosenthal. Now, film historians haven't been able to find much about Rosenthal at all, even where she was from or when she was born. Some think that she was the daughter of a Lithuanian minister, others that she was Jewish. She may have been a volunteer nurse in Vienna, or even a cabaret dancer. But whoever Rosenthal was, by 1920, Lang looked at her less as his wife and more as an obstacle to his relationship with von Harbou. Honestly, neither Fritz nor Thea had much bandwidth for their respective spouses by this point, not after the demands of their jobs and their affair. During the making of 1920's The Wandering Image, the first von Harbou-Lang collaboration, Fritz couldn't even make time to attend his own mother's funeral. Instead, he was off in the Alps with his crew and his cast, which included, awkwardly, Rudolf Klein-Rogge in a supporting role. Von Harbou and Klein-Rogge separated that same year, 1920. It couldn't have been easy for him when Thea moved out and rented a flat in Lang's own building to be closer to her paramour and his colleague. But despite what must have been a painful, even humiliating experience for him, Klein-Rogge managed to maintain a strong working relationship with his ex-wife and her new lover. After The Wandering Image, he acted in at least 7 more Lang von Harbou films. Most memorably, he gave show-stopping performances as the title character in both of the Dr. Mabuse films, and basically invented the mad scientist trope with his performance as Rotvang in Metropolis. Despite the personal turbulence, there seems to have been a lot of mutual respect between Lang, von Harbou, and Klein-Rogge, and for good reason. These three were amongst the best at what they did, and their shared desire to make great films overcame whatever bad blood there was between them. Lisa Rosenthal, however, she wasn't an artist singularly committed to a craft. She was like the rest of us, a regular human being who wanted to love and be loved. But by the time Lang fell for von Harbou, he thought of Rosenthal as little more than an unfortunate complication. Not that he spent that much time worrying about her feelings or handling the love triangle with a modicum of grace. Rosenthal couldn't have been happy when von Harbou moved in practically next door. Even more insulting, Fritz was making hardly any effort to hide his affair, openly traipsing around Berlin with von Harbou on his arm. As you can imagine, this introduced more than a little bit of conflict into the marriage. The husband and wife were fighting all the time, often bitterly. One of Rosenthal's friends recounted a particularly disturbing incident that took place during a publicity tour in Paris. Fritz and Lisa were in the midst of a particularly ugly argument in their hotel room when Lang brandished his Browning pistol at his wife, waving it around menacingly. For all his talent and vision, Lang could be monstrous to the people in his life, be they actors on set or his own spouse. There's a reason that Patrick McGilligan's definitive biography of the man, a book that was my primary resource for this episode, it's titled Fritz Lang, The Nature of the Beast. But historically speaking, being an asshole hasn't been an impediment to success in the film industry. As early as The Wandering Image, Lang was developing a reputation as a brilliant bastard. On set, he was exacting, often demanding that scenes be shot and reshot upwards of 30 times. He screamed at his underlings, whether they were anonymous stagehands or superstar actors. It's almost as though he didn't see the people around him as people. They were the tools by which he brought his vision to the screen, and nothing more. The few affectionate words he had for his colleagues were reserved for those he considered to be the most valuable tools in his toolbox, as when he spoke of, quote, "my beloved Fritz Arno Wagner, the genius cinematographer who shot classics like F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, G.W. Pabst's Threepenny Opera, and Lang's own M and the Testament of Dr. Mabuse." Lang and von Harbou's first collaboration with Wagner, however, was 1921's Der Müde Tod, which literally translates to weary death or tired death, but is known in English as Destiny. Honestly, this is where the Lang-von Harbou train really leaves the station. It's the earliest of their films that's still worth watching for people who aren't absolute obsessives. The great Spanish surrealist Luis Buñuel, director of Un Chien Andalou and The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, he even said that this was the film that made him want to make movies. Destiny was an anthology film of the kind that we don't often see anymore, but that were really common during the silent film era, particularly in Germany. The film opens with the personification of death, essentially the Grim Reaper, riding into town. He's obligated to carry out God's will, and in so doing he takes the life of a young man, devastating the woman who loves him, played by Caligari star Lil Dagover. Taking pity on her, Death brings her to a room filled with candles, each one representing a different human life. He points out 3 candles in particular, and says that if she can save any of those lives, he'll bring back her beloved. We then get 3 stories of doomed love, the first set in Baghdad, the second in Venice, and the third in China, each of which star Dagover and her romantic lead, Walter Janssen, in different roles. When the woman fails to rescue any of the characters, Death gives her one final chance. If she can find someone to trade places with her man within the hour and die on his behalf, she can have him back. She begs a few sick and elderly people to give their lives, but, understandably, none of them want to die for a stranger. Then, a building goes up in flames, and she runs inside, finding a baby left alone. The woman very nearly hands the baby over to Death, but she can't bring herself to do it. Instead, she lowers the baby out a window to its mother, accepts her own fiery demise, and Death reunites her with her lover. Destiny works on pretty much every level, emotional, thematic, and visual. The film is anchored by its unusually humane portrayal of the character of Death, played here by Bernhard Goetzke, who, as it happens, also played Dr. Mabuza's nemesis, Detective Von Wink. Goetzke's death is no heartless villain. Rather, there's a melancholy kindness to him that perhaps anticipates a more famous personification of life's finality in Ingmar Bergman's 1957 classic, The Seventh Seal. In Destiny, it's clear that death's job is an unhappy business. You can see as much on Goetzke's weary, hangdog face. But he looks on the forlorn lover with compassion. Lang claimed to have been inspired by a fever dream he'd had on the threshold of boyhood and adolescence. He remembered his crying mother's face receding into the distance as he was led to the other side by death, quote, the dark stranger, made of black and white, light and shade, the rib cage, the naked bones, in a wide-brimmed hat. Lang's feelings about the episode, which he later recounted to the Berliner Tageblatt newspaper, were ambivalent. Quote, it was horror, but without panic. And even the horror made way for a kind of mystical ecstasy, which gave me, boy though I still was, the complete understanding of the ecstasy which made martyrs and saints embrace death. I recovered quickly, but the love of death, compounded by horror and affection, which the Gothic master depicted, stayed with me and became part of my films. Now, I can't say this for sure, but this story strikes me as bullshit. Lang was notorious for inventing anecdotes that seem a little too poetic to be true. But whatever the inspiration, the version of death that Lang describes there, both terrifying and endearing, it's the version that we get on screen. Like all Europeans of his generation, Lang was intimately acquainted with death. During the war, he'd been a decorated soldier in the Austrian army, earning 2 silver medallions and the prestigious Karl Troop Cross, and as you can imagine, the harsh realities of mortality were omnipresent for him. As McGilligan describes in The Nature of the Beast, everywhere Lang went on the Eastern Front, suspected traitors dangled from trees. Stumps of bodies jutted out of frozen mud. Soldiers near to him bled to death from bullet wounds, or from shells that blew away pieces of their flesh. There was a surfeit of amputees, and worse, in the hospitals. Given those experiences, it doesn't seem like Lang needed a childhood dream to develop a nuanced understanding of death. In the context of such a grisly war, it seems perfectly understandable that a person could feel the horrors of death while also seeing it as an almost benevolent figure, an end to suffering. Lang had risen to the rank of lieutenant during the war, but on the film set, he thought of himself as a general. Fritz Lang was the kind of guy who referred to himself in the third person. He could be imperious and had little concern for the well-being of his cast and crew. Fires and explosions are a common motif in the films he directed. Remember that Destiny ends with an inferno. And he routinely pushed his cameramen to put their bodies on the line to get the shot. Actors, and especially actresses, also faced his wrath. Lang was cruel to Dagover, who he seems to have considered little more than a pretty face. And here, still so early in their career, you also see a dynamic emerging, where in addition to her writerly duties, von Harbou was also tasked with mending the feelings Lang hurt and the egos he bruised. With Dagover and beyond, she had a knack for calming things down after Lang had riled them up. It's interesting, and in some ways frustrating, to see how for even a woman as accomplished as von Harbou, a professional life still entailed these gendered expectations. On set, Lang was the harsh father and von Harbou the nurturing mother. She even knitted sweaters for the cast and crew. To be fair, Lang pushed himself nearly as hard as he pushed the people around him. For instance, Destiny's China sequence required a magic scroll to unroll itself and bow to the Emperor. At this point in film history, this could not be done in post-production. Here's Lang in a 1974 interview with William Friedkin, the director of The French Connection and The Exorcist.
In these days, the labs in Berlin didn't exist like they exist here. For example, you couldn't say now, I would like to have this and this, put it into the lab, the people of the lab will do it. We have to do it in the camera.
For the scroll scene, the actor had to be filmed, then that same footage would be sent through the camera again, one frame at a time, capturing the scroll, which was pinned to a black velvet covered wall, while its parts were slowly, painstakingly moved to create an animated stop-motion effect. The designer Robert Hurlt wrote later about how Lang threw himself into this tedious job. Quote, "Shooting thus in stop action, each frame separately exposed, the letter or scroll had to be rearranged some 800 times to produce 50 seconds of film. Every time, Lang himself jumped up and changed the pins supporting the giant letter. He worked incessantly, the sweat pouring down his face, but he was so involved that he forgot time and place." Hurlt goes on to say that only Lang had been able to envision the effect, but that when the results were played back, the crew was stunned by its perfect execution. Lang's work, he wrote, seemed to us like magic making. And Destiny is filled with these moments, where Lang's obsessiveness creates stunning images to tell the story that he and von Harbou wrote together. The China segment, for instance, also has a groundbreaking flying carpet sequence that would inspire the Douglas Fairbanks vehicle, The Thief of Baghdad. Then there's the gothic beauty of the Venice story, which Krakauer compares to a drawing brought to life, and which Eisner wrote recalls an iridescent impressionism. There's the procession of the dead, marching translucent into the huge, unending wall that cordons off death's domain. And throughout, there are the beautiful innovations of cinematographer Fritz Arno Wagner, who managed to capture nighttime footage that had previously been thought impossible with the hand-crank cameras of the era. All of this comes together beautifully, and the film has the feel of a single, complete piece of art. Lang's spectacles don't overwhelm his and von Harbou's story. They serve it. The results are fantastic, even if German critics and audiences didn't immediately realize it. Its first theatrical run in Berlin lasted just 2 weeks, and an infamous newspaper headline of the day dismissed it as The Tiresome Death, playing off its German title, The Tired Death. However, the reviews from France, Britain, and elsewhere were rapturous, and Germans quickly reassessed their opinions, clamoring for another run in theaters and eventually hailing the film as a masterpiece.
What's he like?
He's a director.
He's the best.
He'll agree with you.
On top of their cinematic meditation on mortality, there was another off-screen death hanging over Lang and von Harbou as they made Destiny, one that still remains mysterious a century later. Sometime in late 1920 or early 1921, the pair were having sex on Lang's couch when they were discovered by his wife, Lisa Rosenthal. There are different theories about what happened next, but by the end of the encounter, Rosenthal was dead from a bullet through the chest. The gun that fired the shot was the same Browning that Lang had brandished at her during that trip to Paris. Lang and von Harbou claimed that Rosenthal had pulled the trigger on herself. She was so distraught, they said, at seeing the affair thrown in her face in her own home, that she went into the bathroom, sat down in the tub, and committed suicide. There were no other witnesses to the incident, just the director, the screenwriter, and the now dead Rosenthal. So it's tough to get a handle on what precisely happened. But it is clear that not everyone accepted the couple's version of events. As we already know, the word of Fritz Lang is worth jack shit. And people who knew him suspected that he may have killed his wife. People including Karl Freund, who along with Fritz Arno Wagner, was one of the 2 best cinematographers working in Weimar, Germany. Freund claimed that he was called to Lang's apartment the night of the incident, and that he came away with the strong intuition that the suicide story was not the truth, or at least not the whole truth. Erich Palmer was already there when Freund arrived, and the producer quickly went to work protecting 2 of his studio's most valuable assets, Lang and von Harbou. The whole thing was swept under the rug. Because of the suspiciously long time between the shooting and their call to the police, Lang and von Harbou were brought before the court to answer for accusations of denial of assistance. Palmer, however, he made sure that their record stayed clean, and in fact, he made sure that everything about the incident was expunged from the legal record. The biographer Patrick McGilligan notes that in all of his research, he couldn't even find an official record of Rosenthal's death. With all the dodginess surrounding this case, It's no wonder that Frun suspected that Lang bore more responsibility than he and his lover were letting on. We know, after all, that he'd previously waved that very gun in his wife's face, and that he was, as the editor of the Film Courier put it, a nasty customer. Lang was and would continue to be an exceptionally cruel individual for his whole life, and one with a particular hostility toward women. Then there's that missing time between the gunshot and the call to the police. And, perhaps strangest of all, Lang held the burial as quickly as he could, even before Rosenthal's father could make it to Berlin to say goodbye. Lang was a man who was monomaniacal about pursuing what he wanted, and as we'll see again in a few minutes when we get to the making of Metropolis, he did not care who he hurt in the process. He wanted von Harbou, and his inconvenient marriage to Lisa Rosenthal was in his way. It surely seems within the realm of possibility that he killed her, either intentionally or in the midst of some kind of struggle. Or if she did shoot herself, it's possible he was slow to come to her aid out of some concern for his professional reputation. Or maybe he and von Harbou were telling the truth, and the shock or the trauma kept them from picking up the phone. Palmer did such a thorough job of cleaning up the mess that it's really hard to know what happened. But once rumors started circulating through the Berlin film scene, for many it wasn't a stretch to think that Lang was a killer, and that von Harbou was helping him conceal his crime. Whatever the truth of Rosenthal's demise, it didn't stop Lang and von Harbou's ascent in the film industry. They followed up Destiny with 1922's Dr. Mabuse the Gambler, the 4.5-hour epic of Weimar chaos that we looked at in depth last week. Mabuse was their first project after Dekla, that proud little production house that kicked off the expressionist film movement with Caligari, after it was absorbed by the German mega studio UFA. Lang and von Harbou now had access to the resources of the country's premier production company. Given UFA's centrality to German film, it's worth spending a minute on its history. Prior to World War I, Germany didn't have much of a film industry to speak of. And since it was fighting against the top film-producing countries, namely the United States and France, it was cut off from their movies until the war's end. This, of course, meant fewer options for German moviegoers, and since the country's opponents were using their own films for propaganda purposes, it meant that the movies distributed elsewhere often had a strong anti-German bias. The German government responded to these issues by essentially nationalizing the country's film industry. With the founding of Universum Film AG, better known as UFA, Germany consolidated its major studios under one banner in 1917. The idea was to build an organization capable of competing with the films coming out of Hollywood and Paris, one that could present a good face for Germany abroad, both through out-and-out propaganda films and more typical entertainments. This development coincided with a ban on imported films from abroad. From 1916 to the end of 1920, the German industry was given the opportunity to grow without competition from foreign films. Movie houses from Bonn to Berlin didn't have the option of showing popular foreign pictures like D.W. Griffith's Intolerance or the Mary Pickford vehicle Daddy Longlegs. They could only show the products of their own country's nascent industry, films that might have struggled against competition from more established studios abroad. Some of these movies were genuinely interesting, like the 6-part serial Homunculus, which tells the story of a Frankenstein-like creature enraged at his inability to feel love. Ernst Lubitsch, who would eventually move to Hollywood and direct films like Heaven Can Wait and The Shop Around the Corner, he made the 1919 historical epic Madame Dubarry, which was a spectacle on a scale that German studios had never attempted. Other filmmakers, though, had very different ambitions. Once the war ended and Germany's restrictive monarchy was demolished, many of its movies went in another direction. Which direction, you might ask?
It's pure pornography.
But of course it is, darling.
To cite one example, Das Mädchen und die Männer, which translates to The Girl and the Men, it was advertised as, quote, a very spicy picture drawn from the life of a girl who storms through her life in the arms of men. Other films bore titles like Lost Daughters, Hyenas of Lust, Vow of Chastity, and, straightforwardly, prostitution. But whatever their aim, whatever their quality, the profitability of German movies was bolstered by the fact that German filmgoers had no other options, all but forcing them to spin their marks on the national industry and to help it grow. Counterintuitive as it may seem, even the hyperinflation that followed World War I was a boon to studios. The money in your pocket today could easily be worth half as much tomorrow, so saving for the future was quite literally irrational. This meant that people spent their earnings as soon as they got them. Bars, cabarets, and the film industry all reaped the benefits. The studios themselves had similar incentives to immediately spend their income. Rather than sit on their profits, they immediately reinvested them. UFA threw money at its facilities in Tempelhof and Neubabelsberg, and within just a few years, Germany's movie-making infrastructure was as cutting-edge as anywhere in the world. What's more, other countries saw an influx of German movies. Hyperinflation put Germany in a great position to export its films to other nations. South American and Eastern European theaters in particular took advantage of the fact that the plunging value of the German mark made it much cheaper to import films from Berlin than from Hollywood or Paris, and German studios were more than happy to oblige them, thereby increasing revenue and boosting the country's reputation as a cinematic powerhouse. Palmer, Lang, and von Harbou, all of whom were welcomed into UFA's big Teutonic embrace, they made the most of their new resources. Palmer now had the power to dispense as much of UFA's money as Lang wanted, allowing him to make Mebuza into maybe the most action-packed movie to land on the German screen up to that point. Shootouts, explosions, high-speed car chases. In a lot of ways, the film was the Weimar version of The Fast and the Furious. And Lang put himself right in the middle of the action. One nighttime scene entailed a car chase with bullets flying through the windshield. To get the shot right, Lang sat in the back seat behind the driver and, well, here's what the production designer Eric Kettelhut wrote about it. The car zoomed down the street with Lang in it and he shot the holes in the windscreen. The light was dim, the car was shaking, and he shot right over the driver's head. Lang was similarly involved in the climactic police siege. As actors rushed towards Mebuza's headquarters, Lang stood on a riser and fired a real gun right over their heads, blasting the door open. This guy liked his guns. As straight up frightening as his methods could be, the success of Dr. Mebuza the Gambler cemented Lang as the most important German director of his generation, rivaled only by Nosferatu's F.W. Murnau. And, as the primary author of his stories, von Harbou was now the most important German screenwriter. In August of that year, 1922, they formalized their status as the ultimate industry power couple and got married. With very few exceptions, they would never speak about the death of Lisa Rosenthal ever again. Hi y'all. This is the second of your 2 weekly reminders that I, Travis Mushet, host of The Haunted Screen, officially endorse Fujifilm cameras. I know from experience that Fujifilm gear is top-notch. With its intuitive controls and vivid colors, it'll always help you get the perfect shot. And in case Fritz Lang is listening from beyond the grave, I am using the word shot metaphorically here. There's no need to bring real firearms on set, because with Fujifilm, you can get great images without putting your crew in mortal danger. How's that for a new slogan? No? At some point they're going to quit letting me write these ads myself, aren't they? Dr. Mebuza was a distinctly Weimar epic, proudly and purposefully a product of its time. For the next collaboration, von Harbou and Lang decided to make something just as epic and just as German, but they moved the action from their present day back into a mythological past. The result was Die Nibelungen, based on the Nibelungenlied, an epic poem from the Middle Ages that also served as the inspiration for Richard Wagner's Ring cycle of operas. Like Dr. Mebuza the Gambler, the Nibelungen was massive, requiring 2 parts and nearly 5 hours to tell its story. And that story is a complex one, complex enough that I'm not going to recount the whole thing here. But you can probably imagine the genre: courageous knights, bitter betrayals, dwarves, dragons, a search for vengeance, and an apocalyptic finale. And given what you've heard about the couple so far, the production process went about as you'd expect. Despite Lang's co-writing credit, Thea von Harbou did the heavy lifting on the screenplay. In a rarity for their partnership, Lang isn't even credited as a co-writer for the film's second part. And Fritz? He was an asshole on the set, gobbling amphetamines, berating the crew, and behaving like such a malevolent control freak with his actors that they often clammed up, leading to some noticeably wooden performances. Von Harbou was always there not just to contribute to the creative decisions, but to calm everyone's frayed nerves and even to cook for the team. And at this particular historical moment, food was of particular concern. Filming took place during the heart of the hyperinflation crisis. To ease the stress on the crew, Ufa bought up a big load of groceries at the start of each week. Prices were rising so rapidly at this point that wage earners often got paid twice a day because the value of their money would plummet between the morning whistle and quitting time. When the studio sold its groceries to the crew on payday at the end of the week, however, it only charged those start-of-the-week prices, which were often a fraction of what they'd be paying if they shopped at a normal store. The gesture must have helped morale on set, as did Lang's willingness to incorporate the ideas of the people around him. The man could definitely be a bastard, but he also knew what he was there for: to make the best film possible. One longtime set designer compared the dynamic to a medieval builders guild. And working with many of the same people who had served him well in his previous films, Lang made a movie of undeniable visual style, pulling on expressionist influences, Art Nouveau, and like his rival Murnau had in Nosferatu, the paintings of German Romanticism, which were a particularly appropriate inspiration for a film steeped in an idealized version of Germany's past. Lang's perfectionism kept him tinkering on Die Nibelungen right up to the film's premiere on February 24, 1924. I mean this literally. The week before the film was set to open, he realized that he wasn't happy with the editing and decided to take a razor to the celluloid and start again. Despite essentially not leaving the editing room for days, when the evening of the premiere arrived, he still wasn't finished. Doing their best to manage the clusterfuck that Lang had gotten them into, Ufa arranged to have the film driven reel by reel on the 45-minute trip between the studio and the theater as the director finished each section. As one attendee put it, when the second reel was being shown, he was cutting the third. As you might imagine, this plan was a disaster. Lang just couldn't re-edit his film fast enough, causing several interruptions as the staff at the Ufa Palast am Zoo Theater struggled to make this all-time bad idea work, and the orchestra on hand tried to fill the awkward pauses with an unscheduled concert. When the film finally started again, the musicians were rewarded with a movie that no longer matched their score, forcing them to rewrite it on the fly. The reviews were neither as catastrophic as the premiere, nor as rapturous as those that met Dr. Mabuse the Gambler 2 years earlier. But there was one group that would come to love this spectacular celebration of Germanness. And I bet you can guess who they are.
Sie können uns meinetwegen töten, kapitulieren werden wir nicht.
Yeah, the Nazis fucking loved Die Nibelungen. A rebranding of an earlier far-right organization, the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or the National Socialist German Workers' Party, it was established in February 1920. Their message was simple. The great and glorious German military would have been victorious in World War I had they not been stabbed in the back by those disloyal Jews, communists, and Jewish communists. And only an authoritarian leader can clean up the mess that democracy has made of post-war Germany and lift the Aryan master race to its rightful place at the top of Europe's and the world's pecking order. As racist and ahistorical as that narrative is, it had a definite appeal in a country still shocked and humiliated by the war's outcome, especially for soldiers who had been through hell for no good reason, many of whom had joined the Freikorps to fight communists during the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919. The Nazi message both tempered their shame and gave them a target for their rage. It told them, it's not your fault you lost. It's not your fault that the life you had before the war has been blown to hell and that your country is now a chaotic, volatile place. It's the Jews' fault. It's the communists' fault. It's the fault of the liberal Democrats and anyone else who couldn't get behind a program of racist authoritarianism. Ultimately, it would be the party's 55th member who would come to dominate it, and eventually to dominate Germany. Again, you know who I'm talking about here.
Heil Hitler.
What? You can heil me better than that.
Yeah, it's Adolf Hitler. In 1919, Hitler had joined the German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party in its embryonic form, and his infamously compelling public speeches had quickly made him the movement's most important figure. Thousands of people would show up to beer halls to listen to his seductive rantings about who they should hate, and by 1921, he'd consolidated power as the party's Führer, or leader. That same year, the group established its paramilitary wing, the SA, also known as the Brown Shirts. So the same year that Lang and von Harbou's film Destiny premiered, the Nazis found their boss and organized their street thugs. Come 1922, another right-wing movement seized power in Italy.
Le forze navali dell'Italia fascista.
In October of that year, Benito Mussolini led around 30,000 members of the National Fascist Party in what became known as the March on Rome. King Victor Emmanuel III was worried that the country was teetering on the edge of civil war, so he exercised his constitutional authority to can the liberal prime minister and replace him with Mussolini. The fascists had executed a successful coup without firing a shot. Hitler and his Nazis were inspired by the events in Italy and also by events closer to home. With inflation already on the rise, Germany defaulted on its reparation payments to the nations that it had lost to in World War I. These are the reparations that we discussed in greater detail in last week's episode. The defaults, in turn, set the table for France and Belgium's occupation of Germany's Ruhr Valley in January 1923. Those countries sought to use the assets in this industrial region to get the payments that Germany was no longer paying. Germans in the valley responded with passive resistance, refusing to work on behalf of their foreign occupiers, and the German government backed them, paying the workers who were effectively on strike. To make these payments, Germany resorted to printing more cash, which helped boost the already rampant post-war inflation to truly insane levels. At one point, there were 200 factories working full-time to pump out more banknotes. With all that currency floating around, the German mark became essentially worthless. How worthless? Well, you'll see different numbers out there, all of them stunning. Depending on your source, you'll find that at the peak of inflation, a loaf of bread cost 100 billion or 200 billion or even a trillion marks. Things would stabilize by 1924, but for a few years there, it was chaos. This mayhem is the reason that even today, people continue to use Weimar hyperinflation as a boogeyman. Then as now, inflation is a convenient cudgel that groups out of power can use to bludgeon the governing administration, and the Weimar era remains, forgive the pun, the gold standard. Here's the American media's foremost white nationalist quoting one such specious comparison.
The founder of FedEx, Fred Smith, summed it up this way, quote, "Had we passed the Build Back Better bill that Biden wanted, my guess is that we would be Weimar Germany right now. We'd have 25% inflation rather than 9 or 10%. So the one thing we can say with certainty about the White House in the spring of 2022 is that Joe Biden is not running it. Joe Biden is gone. In his place are unelected ideologues, people who do not care what the price of gas is. They don't care if you can afford dinner at Applebee's with your kids. They don't care even if war with Russia could cause the destruction of entire populations. Those things are not interesting to them. They care about theories, not reality.
Does anybody believe Tucker Carlson's ever seen the inside of a fucking Applebee's? Anyway, this spiraling economic situation, along with a communist uprising in Hamburg, it caused a growth spurt for the Nazi Party, with its ranks rising from a few thousand to around 20,000 members. If it's possible to boost the confidence of a man who already thought himself to be the savior of his country, the Nazis' modest but real surge in support gave Hitler just such a boost. So in Munich on November 8, 1923, while Fritz Lang was probably berating an actress on the set of the Nibelungen, 600 Nazis rolled out a machine gun and surrounded the beer hall where the leaders of the Bavarian state government were attending a speech. Hitler and an entourage of 20 or so fuckheads, they strolled into the hall and old Adolf fired a gun into the air and declared that, quote, "The national revolution has broken out." So started the event that's remembered as the Beer Hall Putsch. The Nazis pulled Bavaria's leaders into a side room, pointed guns at them, and demanded that they support an insurrection that the party hoped would inspire a march on Berlin and, ultimately, a fascist coup. The leaders resisted, so Hitler returned to the main hall and used whatever dark charisma he possessed to rally the 3,000 or so in attendance to his side. He also called up Erich Ludendorff, the leader of the German military in World War I and the architect of the stab in the back myth, and he asked him to come to the hall, talk to the recalcitrant officials, and convince them into putting him in charge, Ludendorff in charge. Ludendorff wasn't officially a Nazi, but he was definitely a fan, and he heeded the call. Literally held at gunpoint, the frightened city leaders eventually pledged their support for the coup, and with the esteemed old general now in the building, Hitler felt secure enough to leave the beer hall to manage Nazi uprisings elsewhere in the city. He shouldn't have. Expressing a sudden enthusiasm for the overthrow of the Weimar Republic, Munich's leaders talked Ludendorff into letting them leave so that they could set the wheels of revolution in motion. But once outside the Nazis' grasp, they immediately renounced their support for the fascists and set to work putting down the uprising. Ludendorff's blunder left the insurrectionists without any real leverage. Hitler biographer Volker Ulrich aptly referred to the Nazis' preparation for the putsch as dilettantisch. Their whole plan hinged on obtaining the support of the hostages that they allowed to slip through their fingers. These guys just hadn't put much thought into basic strategy or logistics, neglecting, for example, to coordinate seizures of vital locations like army barracks or communications centers. After a half-hearted attempt to take more hostages, Hitler and about 2,000 Nazis, many of whom were drunk by this point, they marched aimlessly around the city and got into a firefight with the police that left 16 fascists dead. Hitler's resulting trial started on February 26, 1924, just 2 days after Die Nibelungen's disastrous premiere in Berlin. He was ultimately sentenced to 5 years in prison, of which he served just 1, and he used that time to write Mein Kampf. Obviously, Germany hadn't heard the last of Hitler. It's almost as though when a political leader launches a full-on assault against democratic institutions and doesn't face any substantive consequences, they will continue to undermine said institutions. Even if it pisses off their supporters, reckless would-be authoritarians must be held accountable or they will inevitably try again. I trust y'all are smart enough to know that I'm not just talking about Weimar Germany here, right? Okay, good. Now, I'm not sure when Hitler first watched Die Nibelungen, but he apparently liked what he saw. The critic Lotte Eisner, who usually bends over backward to excuse Fritz Lang of anything, she admitted that it was the favorite viewing of Hitler and propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. It's not hard to see why. The movie reaches into the same kind of phony mythological past that the Nazis used to justify their pseudo-historical fantasy of a noble Aryan ancestry, and these brutal but righteous Germanic characters are pitted against an army of Huns that are, in Eisner's, well, fucked up phrasing, depicted as, quote, a mixture of cavemen, savages, and redskins, an inferior race that we see scuttling like rats. Jesus Christ, Lotte. However, even here, Eisner can't resist an attempt at exoneration. She claims, with no evidence, that it should be obvious that Lang just thought the portrayal looked cool, and that any racism must have come from von Harbou or Ufa. We also, well, we've got to talk about the dwarves. Even by the standards of the time, these guys were an ugly anti-Semitic stereotype. If you've got the stomach for it, check out a picture of Albrecht the Dwarf King in the show notes. The hooked nose, the beard, the fact that he offers the Teutonic warrior Siegfried the opportunity to become the richest king on earth. It's not great. And this isn't just something that's clear with the benefit of 100 years of hindsight. As a reviewer put it back in 1924, quote, the evil dwarf Albrecht, who represents obscure powers, is, and it can't be mistaken, depicted as a Jew. Not a handsome Jew, naturally, but a vile Jew. Siegfried Krakauer, who shared with Eisner the mantle of Weimar Germany's preeminent film critic, but did not share her unconditional admiration for all things Fritz Lang, he saw other harbingers of a Nazi future in the movie. One character, King Gunther, demonstrated in Krakauer's estimation a loyalty that is motivated by a nihilistic lust for power, which he believes foreshadows a well-known type of Nazi leader. He also conjectures that the organizers of the 1934 Nuremberg rally which was immortalized in Leni Riefenstahl's infamously effective propaganda film, Triumph of the Will, drew direct inspiration from the movie. Krakauer writes that the film's theatrical trumpeters, showy steps, and authoritarian patterns reappear, extremely magnified, in the modern Nuremberg pageant. Now, as I mentioned in the first episode of this season, Krakauer had a habit of reading everything in Weimar film as a prelude to Hitler, and it's possible that Die Nibelungen and Nuremberg were drawing from the same visual vocabulary of German myth, rather than the latter being directly inspired by the former. But I've put some images that Krakauer uses to make this comparison in the show notes. Check them out and judge for yourself. Now, like Murnau, whose Vampire and Nosferatu also evoked anti-Semitic imagery, there doesn't seem to be much historical evidence that Lang had any personal animosity toward Jewish people. And remember that while he grew up a practicing Roman Catholic, his mother was born Jewish. But whatever his intention, and this puts Die Nibelungen a step beyond Nosferatu, his movie was eventually employed for explicitly racist ends. By 1929, a Nazi paper was hailing Lang's creation as, quote, a film of German loyalty. Goebbels spoke publicly of his admiration for the movie, and while they suppressed Die Nibelungen's second part for its portrayal of a vengeful Germanic killing spree, the Nazis re-released Part 1 with a new soundtrack by the proto-fascist composer Richard Wagner, who, it should be said, Lang despised. Now, it doesn't seem that Lang set out to make a political film. At this point in his life, he didn't seem to care much about anything besides movies and, of course, Fritz Lang. In his own telling, politics just wasn't something he paid much attention to.
I was not thinking very much politically before I finished Metropolis. This may come later, I don't know. As I talk to you, I worked with a kind of sleepwalking security.
But regardless of his intent, Die Nibelungen was political. If there's one larger point I'm trying to make with this podcast, it's that no human and nothing made by humans can exist outside of history. Like everyone else, artists are shaped by the world around them, by the stories their culture tells, by the store of tropes and images that are there for them to draw from. And up to the very end of his life, the legacy of Die Nibelungen was something that Lang seemed to wrestle with. In an interview that came out the month after he died in 1976, more than half a century after the film's release, he put it this way: "When I made my films, I always followed my imagination. By making the Siegfried legend into a film, I wanted to show that Germany was searching for an ideal in her past, even during the horrible time after the First World War in which the picture was made. To counteract the pessimistic spirit of the time, I wanted to film the great legend of Siegfried so that Germany could draw inspiration from her epic past, and not, as Mr. Krakauer suggests, as a looking forward to the rise of a political figure like Hitler or something stupid of that sort." This isn't the last time that Lang, or von Harbou, would cross paths with their historical moment, or with the Nazi Party. But those are stories for episode 5.
Number 6, Dieter Ritz, serving gold and gams. Very Fritz Lang Metropolis.
The Walmart version.
It was October of 1924.
1923 or 24, I'm not exactly sure.
It was 24. The biographers have the receipts. Hitler was in prison, working on his dipshit opus. And where was Lang?
New York.
He was traveling with a small entourage.
So Eric Bommel, his wife, and I.
And they had his latest film in hand.
Nibelungen was a tremendous success all over Europe. Took it with me to the United States.
Their promotional junket had landed them in New York Harbor. Sitting on their ship, Lang looked out at the Manhattan skyline and, as he tells it, conceived of his next film, the one that I would argue is his most iconic, Metropolis. As he put it later in life, quote, "I saw a street lit as if in full daylight by neon lights, and topping them, oversized luminous advertisements, moving, turning, flashing on and off, spiraling, something which was completely new and nearly fairy tale-like for a European of those days. And this impression gave me the first thought of an idea of a town of the future. Human forces were driven to exploit each other, and thus living in perpetual anxiety. The building seemed to be a vertical veil, shimmering, almost weightless, a luxurious cloth, hung from the dark sky to dazzle, distract, and hypnotize. At night, the city did not give the impression of being alive. It lived as illusions lived. I knew then that I had to make a film about these sensations. About the trip, he told another interviewer, "I remarked to Palmer that under different labels, most humans really are slaves. He said Hollywood would never make a film about this because they live inside of it. So we said, let us make a film about it. I said, let's call it Metropolis." Lang loved to tell this story, and critics and scholars loved to retell it. By one count, over a dozen of them have chosen the former passage, the one about the moving, turning, and flashing advertisements. They've used it to open their book chapters or articles about the film. The only problem is that it's grade A horse shit. The trip to America did happen, but Eric Palmer had publicly discussed the Metropolis project as early as January 1924, a full 9 months before he and Lang landed in New York Harbor. A draft of the screenplay was circulating among Lang and von Harbou's circle of collaborators by May. Now, it's certainly possible that the trip to Jazz Age Manhattan influenced the ultimate look and feel of Metropolis, but Lang's avowed origin story was just another example of his habitual myth-making, a chance for him to rewrite the past in a way that felt more narratively satisfying than reality. And back in the real world, while Fritz and Eric were touring America, Thea von Harbou was hard at work refining her ideas back in Berlin. As was her custom, she dictated the story that would become Metropolis to her secretary while simultaneously knitting to help her stay focused. Before the script, she first put down the narrative in the form of a novel, one that would be serialized in 1926 to build anticipation for the film version, and one that critics mostly dismissed for its overwrought writing and abundant cliches. Now, I've never read the thing, and I don't have any plans to. But here's how the novel starts. Now the rumbling of the great organ swelled to a roar, pressing, like a rising giant, against the vaulted ceiling to burst through it. Freder bent his head backwards. His wide-open, burning eyes stared unseeingly upwards. His hands formed music from the chaos of the notes, struggling with the vibration of the sound and stirring him to his innermost depths. He was never so near tears in his life, and, blissfully helpless, he yielded himself up to the glowing moisture which dazzled him. So yeah, not exactly Shakespeare, or I guess not exactly Goethe, but this florid style was standard for German popular novels at the time. This is a film podcast, though, not a literary one. So for our purposes, the version of von Harbou's story that made it to the screen is more important than the grandiloquence of her fiction. So for those of you who've never seen Metropolis, and for those of you who have but need a refresher, here's a quick synopsis. Sometime in the future, a man named Joe Fredersen rules over the megacity of Metropolis as a kind of technocratic dictator. Metropolis has a strict class hierarchy, where the workers labor underground, while the rich live above them in enormous Art Deco skyscrapers.
That's not fair at all.
Along with the other space-age scions of privilege, Joe's son Freder spends his time playing sports and chasing girls in their own private Eden known as the Eternal Gardens. And yeah, the kid's name is Freder Fredersen.
That's a terrible name.
Freder lives his life in blissful ignorance until a beautiful young woman named Maria bursts into the gardens with a gaggle of poor kids so that they can get a glimpse of the world that they're missing. Freder is, of course, intrigued by Maria, and his curiosity brings him, presumably for the first time, down into the workers' world below.
Down here, you sack of shit!
There he witnesses the explosion of a monstrous machine, which kills and injures a bunch of the workmen. When his all-powerful father appears unconcerned by the incident, Freder decides to team up with the proletariat and help them improve their lot.
Here's some money. Go see a Star Wars.
His first move is to switch places with a worker, and not long after this little Prince and the Pauper maneuver, he winds up attending a speech where Maria rallies the workers with the prophecy of a messiah who will mediate between the classes. Cocky little rich boy that he is, Freder decides that he is said messiah.
It's true. I am the chosen one.
It turns out that Freder's dad Joe and a mad scientist named Rotvang are spying on the speech, and Maria's rabble-rousing has Joe nervous. Conveniently, Rotvang has been working on a robot that can mimic the appearance of any human woman.
It's fucking creepy, man.
We also discover that Rotvang had been in a love triangle with Joe's now deceased wife, Freder's mother, and that the point of his robot was to resurrect her so that he could have the woman he loves once and for all.
Dearly beloved and departed.
Joe, however, demands that Rotvang turn the robot into a replica of Maria so that they can make her go wild, thereby besmirching her good name and staving off a rebellion. Rotvang does make the false Maria, but he does so with the intention of using her to murder Joe and claim control of Metropolis for himself.
Well, you devious son of a bitch.
The false Maria takes the city by storm, toggling between sexy dances
I've got a degree in arse wiggling, mate.
and calls for a scorched earth revolution.
You believe in rebellion, freedom, and love, right?
The workers heed her call and smash up the machines that make the city function, which accidentally causes a giant flood that threatens the lives of the proletarian children.
You left the water running, didn't you?
Freder finally links up with the real Maria, who'd been trapped in Rotvang's laboratory, and together they save the kids while the workers burn the false Maria at the stake.
And what you burn apart from witches? All witches!
Freder and Rotvang fight on the rooftops, Rotvang falls to his death, and Freder fulfills his messianic destiny by getting his dad and the lead worker to shake hands.
Did we just become best friends? Yep!
We finish on a title card that reads, in all caps, "The mediator between head and hands must be the heart." So as you might have gleaned from my little summary, von Harbou was thinking huge with her story. Cutting-edge special effects, ornate sets, an enormous cast. But Lang was eager to bring this outsized vision to the screen, and Eric Palmer was determined to get him the resources he needed to do it. And the resources that Fritz needed were unprecedented. UFA was by this time the biggest, most powerful, and richest studio in Europe, and its average film cost about 175,000 marks to make. Sources conflict when it comes to the Metropolis numbers, but they agree that it was beyond costly. According to Thomas L. Sacer, who is probably the most important scholar of German film since Eisner and Krakauer, the original budget was 800,000 marks, which put it at 4.5 times as expensive as the average UFA film. But by the time the movie was in the can, UFA claimed that its production cost had reached an astronomical 4.2 million marks, 24 times the average. That was literally half of UFA's entire budget for 1925 and 1926, leaving all of its other films to split up the remaining half. Now this figure is disputed. It seemed that UFA fudged the numbers by attributing some of the studio's general overhead costs to Metropolis specifically. But there's no doubt that this film was epically expensive. So where did all that money go? Well, first off, there was the sheer size of the cast. Sources differ significantly here. Lang himself really downplayed the number, perhaps because the extravagant reports helped to earn him a reputation as a spendthrift. But one count puts the total at 36,000 people. 36,000! For comparison, the Lord of the Rings trilogy required a mere 20,000 extras. Granted, Peter Jackson could use CGI technology to populate his battle scenes, but it still gives you a sense of the sheer scope of Metropolis. Strangely enough, one of these extras wound up with the film's starring role. After the first few weeks of shooting, it became apparent that the actor originally cast as Freder wasn't up to the task. As it happened, Thea von Harbou had taken a shine to a handsome young extra named Gustav Freilich, and when it came time to replace the first guy, she got him the job. On top of the cast size, Metropolis took a long time to make. Shooting ran from May of 1925 all the way through October of 1926, quite nearly a year and a half. There wasn't a whole lot of precedent for a sci-fi movie on this scale, so a lot of the special effects had to be invented from scratch. This of course took time. One explosion that lasted just 10 seconds on the screen required a full 8 days to shoot. Of course, things might have moved faster if it weren't for Lang's relentless perfectionism. Most films of the day shot between 6 and 10 times as much footage as ultimately made it to the screen. By one count, Lang's insistence on shooting take after take left Metropolis with 148 times as much. When I read the chapter on Metropolis in the Lang biography, my notes in the margins consist largely of words like sadist, asshole, and piece of shit. The man didn't care about anything other than translating his vision to the screen, and that most definitely includes the health and well-being of his actors. Freilich remembered spending 2 full days on his knees so that Lang could get the shot that he wanted, and by the time the director was satisfied, Freilich could hardly stand up. Another scene required him to pound on a door, and Lang forced him to do it over and over until his fists were literally bloody. But nobody got it worse than Bridget Helm, who was just 17 when she was cast to play the dual role of the real Maria and the fake robot Maria. Honestly, I could spend a whole episode detailing the nightmare that Helm endured on set, but for the sake of time, I'm going to keep it to a couple of particularly egregious anecdotes. The first occurred during the filming of the scene where the mad scientist Rotvang transforms his robot into a Maria clone.
I remember there's a shot where you see the girl sitting and slowly a part of her becomes metal.
This meant that Helm had to wear a body-hugging robot costume made from plaster and something called liquid wood. But remember, the actress was only 17 years old. Between the fitting and the shoot, she'd grown, and a costume that was already skin-tight was now basically unbearable. What's more, the measurements had all been taken while Helm was standing up, but the transformation scene required her to remain seated. This position forced the hard edges of her robot get-up to stab into her body. Lang being Lang, the shoot took hours, effectively torturing Helm the whole time. Then there's the scene where the false Maria is burned at the stake. Before she reached the pyre, Helm's arms were bound, creepily enough, with Lang's own belt, and she was manhandled by a crowd of extras. Here's von Harbou's own account of what happened next. They push her around. The crowd is going wild, laughing like crazy. There, you will burn, damned witch. They push her up to the top of one of the cars where 4, 6, 8 brutal fists are waiting for her. Once, 20 times. And still it is not wild enough, not fantastic enough. Poor little Bridget Helm. The next day her whole body will be covered with bruises. The anger coming from the extras was likely genuine, if not directed at the person who deserved it. A journalist who managed to sneak onto the closed set wrote that Lang had kept them for 15 hours, but refused to pay overtime. And when Helm finally arrived at the pyre, you probably won't be shocked to hear that Lang demanded that they use real flames. Predictably, Helm's dress caught fire. The firefighters on set were able to put it out before the actress was burned, but she was certainly traumatized. A few years after the film's premiere, she told an interviewer that Metropolis was the worst experience that she ever had. It seems like Helm's opinion was the consensus on set. The examples of misery are too many to list here. If you're looking for a rage read, though, check out Chapter 6 of Patrick McGilligan's Lang biography. But Fritz was an absolute monster to everyone during the shoot. Or at least, to everyone who ranked below him in the studio hierarchy. He was the worst kind of slippery asshole. One who buttered up studio executives while abusing anyone who lacked the power to hit back. When members of the crew, who routinely worked 16-hour days, when they were literally being poisoned by the old-fashioned lighting rigs, they were told to, quote, bite the bullet. Adult extras were recruited from Berlin's growing unemployment lines, and the child extras were brought in from the slums. Naturally, they were paid garbage wages and worked under brutal conditions, sometimes freezing, other times sweltering for hours on end. The film's lead, Gustav Freilich, was appropriately scathing in his autobiography, writing, malicious tongues whispered that if he could have, Lang would have only too gladly, and without any scruples, have someone shot, stabbed, or strangled, for, say, an execution scene, murder, or suicide. Then he would have been able to film, guaranteed for real, the death throes of a human being before his life was blotted out.
But can anyone name a single movie where someone on the left took on a more Republican-leaning viewpoint? Doesn't even have to have won an award, just has to exist. Anyone? Anything?
What about Fritz Lang's Metropolis?
How'd you get here?
In my Hyundai Sonata.
All of that human suffering wasn't enough to make Metropolis a financial success. It was, in fact, an unmitigated disaster on the scale of Battlefield Earth or that awful fucking Cats movie. When it became clear halfway through production that the film was likely to be a boondoggle, UFA considered pulling the plug and cutting their losses. They decided against that path, but the studio still fired Eric Palmer, who temporarily fled to Hollywood. UFA's concern was warranted. When the movie debuted in January of 1927, the reception was awful. The surrealist Luis Buñuel, the same guy who had said 1921's destiny is what inspired him to become a filmmaker, he dismissed Metropolis as, quote, trivial, pretentious, pedantic, hackneyed romanticism. The legendary science fiction writer H.G. Wells pilloried what he called the silliest film as immensely and strangely dull. On this side of the Atlantic, the New York Times wrote that it was, quote, a technical marvel with feet of clay, and the New Yorker lamented that it was laid on with a terrible Teutonic heaviness. And the film's muddled politics managed to infuriate viewers from across the spectrum. One Nazi critic insisted that the portrayal of class conflict amounted to an expression of Bolshevism. Actual communists, though, saw the film as being born out of a bourgeois capitalist ideology, and they were enraged by that last scene, where Freder soothes the tensions between workers and bosses, which they viewed as an attempt to, quote, propagate the idea of class reconciliation, the better to further capitalist methods of exploitation. For what it's worth, this is a criticism that Lang would eventually come to accept.
I liked Metropolis when I was shooting it, and I told it to you already. I didn't like it when I finished it, because I think the end, the go between capital brain and hand, the workers, should be the hard was too easy.
Simplistic, you said.
Huh?
You feel now it's too simplistic. Or you felt...
Too simple.
Our old friend Siegfried Krakauer interpreted Metropolis as a proto-fascist project whose message, quote, could have been formulated by Goebbels. One of the aims of Nazi ideology was to overcome class conflict by submerging it beneath the passionate love of country, with labor and capital uniting to serve the interest of the nation, the Ehrenvolk. To use the vocabulary of von Harbou's script, they wanted the German heart to mediate between the bourgeois head and the proletarian hand. Even beyond Metropolis's treatment of social classes, Krakauer saw an anticipation of fascist aesthetics in what he called Lang's penchant for pompous ornamentation. Lang frequently has his mass of workers, and with the alleged 36,000 extras, it certainly qualifies as a mass. He has them move in rigid, geometric patterns, not unlike Nazi soldiers goose-stepping through the streets. Each individual is subsumed into the group and arranged into beautiful shapes that they can't even see or appreciate. Only their ruler, Joe Fredersen, is elevated enough in his skyscraper perch to enjoy the patterns with his totalitarian eye. For what it's worth, Hitler was said to be a huge fan of the film. While Lang was ultimately willing to concede that the movie's politics were naive, he resented Krakauer's suggestion that they were fascist.
When I read his book, I was shocked, because it is untrue. There were 1 or 2 films during the 20s who may have had a relationship with the later days of Hitler, you know. I think the Krakauer book did a lot of damage, especially for young people who believe in it.
Still, Krakauer's reading has dogged Metropolis for decades. But in 1927, UFA was more concerned with its financial losses than with the movie's political legacy. Those losses were significant. The awful reviews kept audiences away, and the enormous crowds that UFA was counting on to recoup its giant investment never materialized. The studio would likely have gone belly up if it hadn't been bailed out by the media mogul Alfred Hugenberg, who bought the studio that spring. There was a reason he was willing to take on such a troubled asset. Ideology. Hugenberg had been elected to the Reichstag as a member of the right-wing German National People's Party, and he would go on to serve as Hitler's Minister of Economics after the Nazis took control in 1933. When it came to UFA, profit wasn't his motivation, or at least not his only motivation. He wanted to make propaganda, and to wrest control of the film industry from, quote, Republicans, Jews, and internationalists. Under the leadership of Hugenberg's loyal deputy, Ludwig Klitsch, UFA would take a hard right turn and increasingly focus on producing films with explicitly nationalist themes. Even UFA's posters started reflecting the reactionary tendencies of the man who owned it. Instead of bordering its promotional material with the customary black, red, and gold of the Weimar Republic's flag, it chose the black, white, and red of the German monarchy, and later, of the Nazi Party. If you'd like to learn more about Germany's various historical flags and what they stand for, I'd recommend checking out episode 7 of the Why the Flag podcast, hosted by Simon Mullen. He dives deep into what these banners symbolize, and it's well worth a listen. In addition to taking UFA in a more ideological direction, Hugenberg and Klitsch restructured the organization and slashed its budget. They also slashed Metropolis. After it was yanked prematurely from German theaters that spring, UFA shaved more than half an hour off the movie for an August re-release, bringing it down to just under 2 hours in length. And Paramount, who distributed the film in the States, it exercised its prerogative to hack the film all the way down to 1 hour and 45 minutes for American audiences. The resulting versions may have been shorter, but they were also incoherent. The editor of the American cut might have been arrogant enough to claim that he had gotten, quote, nearer Fritz Lang's idea than the version he himself released in Germany, but Americans themselves weren't impressed. Metropolis had never really been intended to be a blockbuster in the United States. It was supposed to serve as a big spectacle that would help Americans to generally warm up to German films. That didn't happen. The first feature film with synchronized sound, The Jazz Singer, was released that same year, 1927, and it made Metropolis look suddenly obsolete. Metropolis was rarely screened for about half a century after its initial release. And after all the cuts and recuts, not just in Germany and the US, but basically everywhere it was shown, scholars weren't able to even find a copy of the full original version. In the rare instances that people watched Metropolis, say for a college film class, they were watching a mutilated version, one that was missing around a fifth of its runtime. Still though, the film managed to wedge itself into the popular consciousness. Its imagery and its fairy tale archetypes made Metropolis a powerful reference point. So much so that when one unfortunate soul arrived at the Mauthausen concentration camp, the miserable, uniformed prisoners and the aura of industrialized death brought the film to his mind. He reportedly turned to another prisoner and asked, "Connais-tu Metropolis? Do you know Metropolis?" The movie also stuck with American novelist Thomas Pynchon, and he includes it in his book Gravity's Rainbow. One of the major characters, an engineer named Franz Polker, who helped Hitler build rockets, he is a big fan of Metropolis, and he idolizes Rudolf Klein-Roga's Rotwang as, quote, indispensable to those who ran the Metropolis, yet at the end, the untamable lion who could let it all crash. It makes sense that the film resonated with Pynchon, one of the great writers of postmodernism. With its slick-surfaced beauty, its pastiche of conflicting styles, what Alsacer calls an alphabet soup of the avant-garde, and with the boundary-blurring identity of the Maria robot, Metropolis syncs up nicely with the theories and preoccupations of postmodernist thinkers and artists. It might be that the movie just came out a few decades too early. At any rate, though, it has experienced a resurgence over the last 40 or so years. Its cityscape was a direct and obvious influence on the design of films like Blade Runner and even Tim Burton's Batman movies. It's been referenced in music videos for Madonna, Queen, and Lady Gaga, and Janelle Monáe's first two albums, Metropolis, The Chase Suite, and The Arch Android, they were directly inspired by Lang and von Harbou's creation.
Well, Metropolis is like the blueprint, in terms of sci-fi films, and Fritz Lang is like the godfather of science fiction. So that, out of that, watching that silent film inspired my whole life's work, to date.
Monet's pair of concept albums follow her robot messiah alter ego as she liberates the city's androids. Just look at the album cover in the show notes. And in 1984, an Italian composer released yet another cut of the film.
In 1926, noted director Fritz Lang created a dark and terrifying vision of the future. Now, Academy Award winner Giorgio Moroder has completed a long-term personal project, a reconstruction of Lang's classic motion picture, with a soundtrack created especially for this presentation and performed by today's top musical artists. Giorgio Moroder presents Fritz Lang's Metropolis.
This time the movie was updated with a new wave soundtrack that featured artists like Freddie Mercury, Pat Benatar, and Loverboy. The reputation of Metropolis got another boost in 2008, when film scholars found the Holy Grail.
Now, for the first time in more than 80 years, movie lovers and film historians will be able to see the complete 1927 epic. Over 20 minutes of missing footage was recently discovered in Argentina.
A 16mm negative of the complete film had been languishing for decades in the archives of the Museo del Cine in Buenos Aires. This is the version that you'll find if you watch the movie on YouTube or Prime, and that extra footage, it solves some of the pacing issues and fills in some of the plot holes. We're at the point now where Metropolis is widely regarded as a cinematic landmark, if a flawed one. Now that we can watch it outside of its initial historical moment, it's easier to let its muddled political message be overwhelmed by the sheer power of its images, which are still stunning today. And those images are why I continue to love this film. Aesthetically, it's every bit as inventive as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, but Lang and von Harbou had access to resources that Robert Vina could have only dreamed of. More resources, really, than they had any right to. Honestly, I don't know what to do with the knowledge that all that beauty was made possible by so much human suffering. The cast and crew dealt with a workplace that was beyond toxic. Fritz Lang was a bastard, an abuser, and possibly a murderer. If I heard about a production today that was half as bad as what happened on the set of Metropolis, I'd want the film shut down and the director fired and probably prosecuted. But when I'm watching the movie, that all goes away. It sucks me into its magnificent, terrible, awe-inspiring world. My own reaction makes me wonder if there's maybe something to the argument that there's a nascent fascism embedded in the film. When Metropolis is on the screen, you're subsumed into its spectacle, or I am anyway. Like a Nazi rally at Nuremberg, the aesthetic becomes the thing that matters. The pain underneath, it stays stashed out of sight. But it is there. It's still there, whether or not I choose to look at it. So there's more to the story of Fritz Lang and Thea von Harbou. A lot more. And we'll catch up with them in 2 weeks. Next week, though, we'll take a look at the third iconic director of the Weimar era, behind Lang and Murnau, Georg Wilhelm Pabst. Today's episode gave us a chance to look at the rising right-wing movements in Germany in the 1920s. For the next one, we're going to change pace a little bit. We're going to see what G.W. Pabst, both the man and his films, can show us about the German left. If you're following along, well, you've got a lot of homework. More than any other director that we'll look at this season, Pabst's films directly engage with Weimar politics. And this podcast hangs out at the intersection of cinema and history, meaning there's almost too much to cover here. To help you prioritize, I'm going to rank the movies that we'll be discussing. These rankings are based both on how important the respective films are to next week's episode, and to how much I like them. So here we go. In order of most to least recommended, they are Pandora's Box, Kameradschaft, Westfront 1918, The Threepenny Opera, The Joyless Street, and The Love of Jean Nye. All of these films are up for free on YouTube, and links are available on the show's website, hauntedscreenpod.com. Watch if you want, don't if you don't. Either way, I hope to see you there. The theme song for The Haunted Screen, as well as other music, comes courtesy of the Great Pacific Garbage Vortex. Additional music from Coma Media, DS Technician, Arndt Stelter, Richard Wagner, Jerry Art, Orion Williams, and Track Tribe. In accordance with the principles of fair use, we use clips from Full Metal Alchemist the movie, Conqueror of Shambhala, William Friedkin's interview with Fritz Lang, All About Eve, British Movie Tone, Jojo Rabbit, Tucker Carlson Tonight, The Associated Press, RuPaul's Drag Race, Cabaret, The Twilight Zone, The Tourist, Silence of the Lambs, Arrested Development, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Superbad, The Corpse Bride, How I Met Your Mother, Blazing Saddles, The Full Monty, SLC Punk, Home Alone, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, Step Brothers, Family Guy, CNET, Giorgio Moroder presents Metropolis, and NPR Morning Edition. Thanks so much to our sponsor, Fujifilm, and of course, to you for giving me your time. Until next episode,